The crying had stopped. That was worse. Stacy sat in the silence where Mara's voice had been and felt it like a physical absence, like a missing tooth her tongue kept finding, like the hollow where a wall should be. As long as her daughter had been crying, she'd known something. Mara was close. Mara was breathing. Mara was still here. Now there was nothing. 4 hours and 43 minutes. She knew because she'd been counting heartbeats. Not seconds, she'd lose count of seconds. Her mind too fractured to hold a straight line of numbers when everything kept sliding into the image of Mara's face, pressed against the SUV window, her small mouth forming one word over and over. Mama, mama, mama. But heartbeats she could track, the way she tracked load-bearing calculations and stress tolerances and the invisible math of structures under pressure. Her architecture professor had told her once that the only difference between a building that stands and a building that falls is whether someone took the time to understand the forces working against it before they started building. She'd spent 2 years not understanding the forces working against her. She understood them now. The room was 9 feet by 11 feet. She'd measured it with her body, lying flat heel to crown across both dimensions until she had numbers she could trust. Concrete walls, poured knot block seams running horizontally, stronger against lateral pressure, weaker at the ceiling joins. Single overhead bulb, incandescent, 40 watts, casting yellow light that barely reached the corners. Caught with a steel frame bolted to the wall. Bucket, door of reinforced steel with an electronic lock panel, the kind that ran on a dedicated circuit, the kind with a backup battery that kicked in when primary power dropped. She'd heard the generator since the moment they'd put her in here, felt it more than heard it, a vibration that traveled through the concrete floor and up through the cot frame and into her bones, deep and rhythmic. Below and to the left southwest corner of the building, which meant the mechanical room was there, which meant the main electrical conduit ran along the south wall, which meant the ventilation shaft above her head ran parallel to that conduit and shared the same structural channel. She knew where the power lived. She knew how this building breathed. She pressed her palms flat against the floor and breathed. You are not going to think your way out of this. You are going to feel your way out. That was the thing no one had taught her in architecture school. The best buildings weren't just calculated, they were understood. Felt in the body, known the way you know your own heartbeat. Not because you counted it, but because you lived inside it. She'd spent 2 years calculating, running survival math in her head, adding up risks and exits and contingencies, writing backup plans on slips of paper and keeping them in her pocket like insurance policies. She'd been so certain that clarity was the same as strength, that seeing Min-jae clearly his obsession, his control, his violence, meant she understood the full picture. She hadn't. She'd seen the monster. She'd missed the man who was trying, imperfectly and at tremendous personal cost, to become something else. She'd kept one foot out the door while asking him to be someone who deserved both feet in. She'd demanded his transformation and withheld her trust like a reward he hadn't quite earned. Held the door open but never let go of the handle. And while she'd been so busy being right, Lee Sun-young had been watching, waiting, letting their distrust of each other do her work for her. Pride and secrets, Miss Woods. They cost everyone everything. The woman had been right. Stacy hated that she'd been right. But sitting in a concrete room counting heartbeats while her daughters were somewhere beyond a wall she hadn't found a way through yet, she couldn't afford the luxury of hating the truth just because of where it came from. Somewhere in this building, her daughters were sleeping, or not sleeping. Mara, who woke 3 times a night in unfamiliar places, and needed her mother's hand pressed flat between her shoulder blades before her body would believe it was safe. Clara, who dealt with fear by going completely still, who would close herself off like a room with the lights out and not come back until someone she trusted opened the door and said her name the right way. No one here knew those things. No one here knew which stuffed rabbit Mara had named after Min-jae, or that Clara hummed to herself when she was scared, or that both of them needed their foreheads kissed before they could sleep. Only Stacy knew those things. And Stacy was in a 9 by 11 room, 4 hours and 43 minutes from becoming irrelevant, while that woman rearranged her children's lives like furniture. She looked down at her wrists. The zip ties were still there. Her hands were positioned in front of her body. The contractor who'd brought food hours ago had repositioned them, cutting the original ties and replacing them with fresh ones in front, forcing her to eat with both hands visible where he could monitor them. Practical. Efficient. He hadn't freed her. He'd simply moved the threat to a place he could watch. He hadn't considered what she could do with 18 inches of movement and a cot frame with a rusted bolt where the steel met the wall. She'd been working the bolt loose for 3 hours. Her fingertips were raw. 2 nails were torn back to the quick, dried blood at the edges. But the bolt was loose now, a 3-inch piece of steel with a threaded tip, sharp enough to split plastic if she drove it at the right angle. She looked up at the electronic lock panel on the door, looked at the gap between the panel housing and the wall, a 2mm tolerance, the kind of gap that happened when a contractor cut corners on installation depth, leaving the secondary terminal slightly more exposed than it should have been. She was an architect. She understood load-bearing structures and electrical conduits and the hidden language of buildings. Every structure was also a confession of the shortcuts and human errors of everyone who'd built it. This building was about to confess everything. She wrenched the bolt free. The plastic split on the third strike. Not clean, she'd aimed wrong the first 2 times, her hands trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. But the third strike drove the threaded tip directly into the weak point of the zip tie's locking mechanism, and the plastic gave with a sound like a knuckle cracking. Small, irreversible, the best sound she'd heard in hours. Her hands separated. She sat for 3 seconds, letting her wrists breathe. The flesh beneath was raw and bruised, patterned with the tie's ridges. She flexed her fingers one at a time, left hand first, then right, the way she used to stretch before long drafting sessions. Then she stood up and got to work. The lock panel came off the wall in careful pieces. Not torn, walked. Each anchor point worked loose with the bolt tip. The housing eased from the wall the way you'd ease a tile from old adhesive. Force without precision wasn't problem-solving. It was just making new problems. The secondary terminal was exactly where she'd known it would be. A cluster of low-voltage wiring at a junction point that proper installation would have buried another 2 inches deep. She shorted it with the bolt, touched the bare copper leads together, and held them until the panel buzzed and stuttered, and the red indicator light blinked twice before going dark. The lock disengaged with the sound of a held breath releasing. The door swung inward 3 inches. Stacy pushed it open with her shoulder and stepped into the corridor. Left, right, straight. Another left. She retraced the route she'd memorized during intake, her architect's spatial memory laying down a map she could navigate without sight. The mechanical room in the southwest meant the main corridor ran north-south. The direction of Mara's crying had been north and east. She moved without lights, bare feet on concrete, silent and deliberate. The facility was quiet in the way of occupied spaces at low hours, not empty, but reduced to its skeleton crew. She'd been timing shift patterns since they'd put her in the room. She found the first guard asleep in a folding chair at the corridor's midpoint, his chin on his chest. The professional discipline of the extraction team apparently did not extend to the overnight detail. She walked past him so slowly, she could hear his breathing change, and then settle. The door behind him was unlocked. Inside, Min Jae. He was bound to the chair they'd left him in, his head hanging forward, the blood on his face dried to rust-colored crust in the dim light. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. The bruising at his neck was already going deep purple, a precise, professional strike. His right hand rested against the chair arm at an angle that told her the circulation had been compromised for hours. He looked broken. He looked small in a way she'd never seen him look, and it moved through her like a floor shifting underfoot. She crossed the room without sound and crouched in front of him, put her hands on his face and lifted it. His eyes opened slowly, fighting through layers of pain to find the surface. When they found her, they went through recognition, and then disbelief, and then something so unguarded, it made her look away for a moment. "I wrote the note because I was scared," she said, her voice barely breath-shaped into words. "You found it. You can keep it. I'm done running from what it means." Min Jae's jaw worked. He didn't speak for a long moment, just looked at her with the eyes of a man recalibrating everything he'd assumed about the next several hours of his life. "The girls," he said finally, his voice destroyed, scraped raw, the voice of someone who had screamed for a long time and then stopped because it hadn't worked. "She's moving them to the CO airstrip. Northport. Hangar 7. Jet-fueled. Departure window closes at dawn. How long do we have?" He looked toward the wall where a window should have been. 90 minutes, maybe less. Stacy was already working the restraints. "Then we move." He stood on legs that had been still too long, catching his weight on the desk edge, his right hand hanging uselessly at his side. She put her shoulder under his arm without being asked, and he let her take his weight without deflection, which told her more about the damage than anything he would say. Min Jae did not accept help unless the alternative was the floor. "Server room," he said, 2 doors down. "Before we go, we don't have time. We don't have a future without what's in it." His voice steadied as the adrenaline found his system. 2 minutes. The server room woke in stages, monitors brightening one by one from left to right, hard drives spinning up with the sound of something breathing back to life. Min-jae typed the access code with his left hand, his right braced against the desk, the fingers curling and uncurling in slow contractions as circulation worked its way back through damaged tissue. "Third monitor," he said. Stacy looked. Her first impression was volume. Files, thousands of them. But when her eyes parsed the labels, she understood that this wasn't the obsession she'd feared. Not surveillance logs of her movements. Financial transaction records organized by date and counterparty. Shipping manifests cross-referenced against customs declarations. Correspondence chains, encrypted and then painstakingly decoded over what must have been months. Wire transfers in amounts that made her breath catch. Each one annotated in Min-jae's handwriting with the patience of someone building a case, one grain of sand at a time. A forensic reconstruction of the Lee family syndicate's operations. Not Min-jae's operations. His mother's. The trafficking routes dressed as legitimate shipping. The political bribes paid through layers of corporate intermediaries to men whose names appeared on buildings and at charity galas, whose influence had kept the enterprise running smoothly for longer than Stacy had been alive. The people who had become inconvenient and then become absent. Their disappearances documented in police reports that had gone cold. A ledger so complete it read not like evidence gathered against someone, but like a confession made by a person who finally understood the full scope of what they'd been part of. "The surveillance files on you," Min-jae said, watching her face. "The photos. The tracking reports. They were cover. If anyone found this room, anyone from inside the network, they'd find a man watching a woman. Not a man building a case against his own family." He steadied himself against the desk. "I've been compiling this for 4 years. I was going to deliver it to federal prosecutors after I found a way to keep you and the girls outside the blast radius." Stacy stared at the screen. At years of meticulous, dangerous, solitary work. At the proof that what she'd seen in those files was real but incomplete, a picture she'd read with the frame she'd brought to it. Certain she was seeing everything when she'd been seeing only one layer of something much deeper. "You were going to go to prison," she said. "Yes. You planned it. From the beginning. Yes. Alone." He didn't answer. The room answered for him, the redundant backups. The dead man's switches programmed to upload automatically if he stopped checking in. A system designed to function without him, built for his absence. He'd been building his daughters a father-shaped gift they could only open from the other side of everything. She picked up the burner phone from the desk and dialed from memory. Agent Chen answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting. "This is Stacy Woods," Stacy said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. Or maybe she felt steadier than she thought. "I have the black ledger. I know where the twins are being transported. I need your teams at the Seo airstrip. Northport. Hangar 7. How fast can you move?" A pause. The sound of Chen shifting, of something in the background changing registers. "We've had surveillance on that location for 6 hours, Miss Woods. We've been building probable cause." Another pause, shorter. "Consider this your call. Send the files and give us 8 minutes." Stacy looked at Min-jae. "Where do I send them?" He typed an address into the browser without being asked. She hit send. They went out through the loading dock into a night that smelled like diesel and rain, and the cold breath of warehouses holding their air in the dark. The service truck's keys were in the ignition. Someone's negligence. Their good fortune. Min-jae got in the driver's seat. She didn't argue. He drove with his left hand on the wheel, and his right arm braced against the door, and neither of them spoke. And the silence between them was different from every silence they'd built before. Not the careful distance of two people protecting themselves from each other. Just two people going to get their children back. The rain came sideways when they reached the airstrip. A serious rain, horizontal in the headlight beams, reducing visibility to 30 feet and turning the tarmac into black glass. Min-jae drove through it with the focused attention of someone who'd decided long ago that conditions were not a relevant factor in whether he continued. The hangar lights were visible a quarter-mile out, soft orange glow muted by the downpour. Beyond them, navigation lights, red and white, blinking patient and rhythmic, the heartbeat of a machine waiting to carry her daughters away. Min-jae drove off the service road and directly onto the runway, positioned the truck sideways across the midpoint, headlights blazing into the dark, a blockade that any pilot would have to address before departure. He cut the engine. They sat for a moment in the sudden silence, broken only by rain on the roof. "She has contractors visible," Min-jae said, reading the approach. "Probably more inside. And we have... us." Stacy looked at him. At the damage on his face. At the hand still not fully responding. At the man who had spent 4 years building a case against his own family. Who had planned to surrender himself to prison for the sake of daughters he hadn't yet met. who was sitting in a stolen truck in the rain, preparing to walk toward armed professionals with nothing but his presence and whatever it meant to be him. "Together," she said. Something moved in his face, something old and armored giving way. "Together," he agreed. They got out of the truck into the rain. It hit her immediately, soaked through her clothes in seconds, flattened her hair against her head, ran cold down the back of her neck. She didn't acknowledge it. She walked beside Min Jae across the wet tarmac toward the hangar's orange light, and she felt the clarity that comes when everything has been stripped away. Every calculation, every strategy, every careful positioning. What remained was simply what she was willing to do. She was willing to do this. Whatever this was, Lee Sun-young stepped out of the hangar mouth at 40 feet, preceded by 2 contractors, both armed, both professional, positioning themselves with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. Flanking angles, clear sightlines, no wasted motion. Lee Sun-young stood between them in the orange light, rain darkening her shoulders, still immaculate despite everything. She looked at the 2 people walking toward her across a rain-slicked runway, and her expression was not fear. It was irritation. The mild contempt of someone watching a plan develop a minor complication. The contractors raised their weapons. Min Jae stopped. His hands came up, open, visible, not surrender. Just the acknowledgement of physics. Stacy kept walking. She heard Min Jae say her name behind her, a warning, a restraint, and she kept walking because the calculation had already been made. There was only one geometry in which this ended differently, and that geometry required her to be standing between the weapons and the man they were aimed at. She stopped 4 feet from Lee Sun-young, close enough to see the calculation running behind those precise eyes, close enough that any shot at Min Jae required an angle that risked her. "Miss Woods." The voice cut through the rain like something engineered. "You are making a very foolish. You can kill us." Stacy's voice was quiet and flat, and she meant every word of it. This was not a bluff. It was a truth she'd arrived at somewhere in the server room, or the truck, or the moment she'd crouched in front of Min Jae and told him she was done running. "But you can't stop the upload." The briefest pause. "What upload?" "The Black Ledger." Stacy raised the burner phone. The progress bar read 91%. 4 years of your financial records. Every shipping manifest. Every offshore account. Every payment to every official who ever looked the other way. Every route you ran behind the cover of your son's legitimate enterprises. It's going right now to the FBI's RICO task force, Interpol, 3 federal prosecutors, and every major news organization that covers organized crime, simultaneously. From servers your lawyers would need months to petition to suppress. She watched the bar tick to 94, 95. Your money can't move fast enough, and your name will be on every single one. Lee Sun-young's face remained composed. It was built for composure practiced over decades, but something was happening behind it. The architecture of her expression held, but the load had just increased dramatically, and Stacy, who had spent years learning to read what structures revealed under pressure, could see the stress moving through it, looking for a path. "You have nothing," Lee Sun-young said, and her voice was still controlled, but the register had changed. "My son's obsession distorted into, your son compiled a federal case, 97%, and I just delivered it." The phone vibrated once. Upload complete. Beyond the perimeter fence, headlights appeared. Not one set, many, moving in coordinated convergence from 3 directions, vehicles fanning across the approach road with the practiced simultaneity of teams that had been positioned and waiting. When the emergency lights activated, they turned the rain itself into something that pulsed red and blue, and the whole airstrip flickered with the colors of an authority that had waited patiently for exactly this evidence. Lee Sun-young turned and looked at the lights, then turned back to Stacy. And for the first time in every encounter they'd had, she looked not at an obstacle or a complication or a piece on a board, but at a person. Just a person, standing in the rain. "You think this makes you a mother?" she said quietly, her voice stripped of performance for the first and only time. "You're just a woman who got lucky." Stacy held her gaze without flinching. "And you're just a woman who lost." The FBI came through the fence. Agent Chen moved like weather. Purposeful and without apology, the vehicles spread across the tarmac with controlled choreography, agents materializing from doors before wheels had fully stopped. Their movements organized and unexcitable in the way of professionals who didn't need drama because they had authority, which was better. Lee Sun-young's contractors made one collective calculation and placed their weapons on the tarmac. The contractors inside the hangar took a moment longer to reach the same conclusion. Lee Sun-young didn't run, didn't plead. She stood straight while they moved her hands behind her back, her chin at the angle of a person who had never been compelled to lower it and was not going to start now. Even this was performance. Even now she was composing the story she would tell herself about this moment. An agent guided her head down as they folded her into the vehicle. The door closed with the solid, final sound of something built to contain. Stacy walked to the car. Crouched beside the window where Lee Sun-young's face was visible through rain-streaked glass, the drops running in rivulets between them, the woman's eyes found her immediately. They would always find what they'd decided to watch. "Your name is off the buildings," Stacy said quietly, knowing the glass made her inaudible, saying it anyway, because some things are true regardless of whether they're heard. "The legacy is dead." She stood up, and then the twins were there. She heard Mara before she saw her, that voice, that particular frequency, high and desperate and certain, in the way of a child who has been frightened past the point where uncertainty is possible and has collapsed down to the single pure signal of needing her mother. It cut through everything. The rain, the sirens, the organized noise of federal law enforcement managing a tarmac full of people with things to answer for. She turned. They were running. Both of them, Clara and Mara, their small feet slapping wet tarmac, their arms already extended before they were close enough to catch, their faces streaked with rain and tears, and the particular relief of children who have been frightened badly enough that seeing their mother is not an occasion for composure, but for complete, total surrender to the fact of being found. Stacy dropped to her knees. The impact hit her like a wave, both girls reaching her at nearly the same moment, and she gathered them in with both arms and held on with everything she had. Clara's hands fisted in her hair. Mara pressed her face into the curve of Stacy's neck, with the grip of a child who had decided that letting go was not something she was going to do again for a very long time. The rain came down on all three of them, and Stacy's knees were soaked through, and her shoulder was being twisted at an angle that would ache tomorrow, and she had never, in her entire life, felt anything better than the weight and warmth and heartbeat of these two people against her body. She looked up, through her own tears and the rain, across the wet tarmac, still busy with the organized aftermath of everything that had just changed. She found Min-jae. He was standing 20 feet away with his arms at his sides, not moving toward them, watching his daughters cry into their mother's neck with the look of someone who is memorizing, who understands that what he is watching is a photograph he's going to need to carry for a long time. His eyes found hers over the girls' heads. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. They had used words to build walls between themselves for so long that the absence of them felt not like silence, but like the sound a wall makes when it comes down. All that held air. Suddenly free. Agent Chen appeared at Min-jae's shoulder, and he looked at her, and he nodded once. He walked toward his daughters. Chen gave them 8 minutes, a small, deliberate gesture that cleared the space around the four of them. 8 minutes of the operation folding itself away, of agents finding other things to attend to at the periphery of the tarmac, of federal law enforcement giving itself a pause it wasn't technically required to give. 8 minutes in the rain. Min-jae held the twins against his chest, one in each arm, his eyes closed, his face pressed into the curls he'd spent years watching through camera lenses. From a distance he'd convinced himself was protection. Clara had her face buried in his shoulder. Mara was looking at him with her dark, knowing eyes, reaching up to touch the cut above his eyebrow with 2 fingers, as if confirming the damage was real and survivable. Stacy stood beside him, close enough that her arm was against his arm. She could feel him breathing. The effort it was costing him to stay steady for these girls when everything in his body wanted to fold. "You came back," Mara said, "an accounting. I came back. You always said you would." "I did." Clara pulled back to look at his face, her own face swollen with crying. "Are you going to leave again?" The question sat in the air between all of them. "Yes," he said, steady, honest. Not lying to a 3-year-old when lying would have been easier. "For a while I have to go somewhere. But I'm coming back from that too." Clara considered this. "How long?" "A while. A long while." He looked at Stacy over their daughters' heads, and there was the whole history of everything in that look. All the damage and the reckoning and the years of building and breaking and trying again. "But Mama will be there. And I'll be there too, through glass, until I can be there without it." Mara put her small palm flat against his chest, testing for the heartbeat. Verifying. "Same," she said softly. And Stacy felt the word like something physical, the echo of the very first moment. 2 toddlers on a cottage floor. One of them touching a stranger's face and finding the familiar in the unfamiliar. Min-jae's eyes closed briefly. When they opened, they were clear in the way of someone who has made peace with something. He set the girls down with the care he'd learned to bring to everything he was afraid of dropping. Crouched in front of them on the wet tarmac, his face level with theirs. "I need you to be brave with Mama," he told Mara. "Not for me. For you. And I need you to tell her when you're scared. Don't hide it." Mara nodded, solemn as a promise. He looked at Clara. "Don't go quiet when it gets hard. You talk. You tell Mama everything." Clara launched herself at him again, her arms around his neck with the ferocity of a child who'd decided this goodbye wasn't finished yet. He held her. Let it go as long as it needed. Then he stood. He looked at Stacy for a long moment that contained everything they hadn't said and everything they didn't need to, then said the only thing that mattered. "Wait for me." She nodded once. "I'll be there." And she meant it without calculation, without strategy, without a backup plan in her pocket. They put the handcuffs on him, and he walked toward the vehicle with his shoulders straight and his chin level, and he didn't look back. Not once. She'd wanted him to look back, had wanted the last image to be his face, but she understood. Some exits have to be clean to be survivable. Some last looks are too heavy to carry through what comes next. She watched the door close, stood in the rain with a daughter on each hip, their heads dropping to her shoulders, their breathing slowly steadying. Mara hummed against her neck, the lullaby. That melody that had started everything, dark hallways, bedtimes, a phone call in the night, a tarmac in the rain. It sounded different now. Not like an ending, not quite like a beginning, like a thing that continued. A frequency moving through everything, and keeping going. Stacy turned and walked toward the lights. 3 years passed the way grief passes. Not in a straight line, not with the clean resolution of a story that knows where it's going. In layers, thick and heavy some days, translucent on others, occasionally thin enough that she could see through to something that looked, from a distance, like ordinary life. The house had a yellow door. She'd found it in November, 6 weeks after the tarmac, a rental on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood that was neither safe nor dangerous, just lived in. 2 bedrooms. A yard that was technically a yard. A front door someone had painted yellow a decade ago, gone slightly chalky with age. She repainted it herself on a Saturday in October of the following year, when the twins were at school, and the air smelled like wood smoke, and the particular loneliness of a life being rebuilt from its studs. She used a brush instead of a roller, because she wanted to feel every stroke, wanted the slight irregularity of a human hand, rather than something uniform. The color was called Sunflower. She stood back when she finished, and felt something that wasn't quite pride, but was adjacent to it, the satisfaction of having made something visible that said, "Here, someone lives here, someone chose this." She worked for an architecture firm that specialized in affordable housing. Not glamorous work, not the kind that appeared in design publications or generated awards, the kind that required knowing what a family actually needed from the space it lived in, how much room a child needed to do homework without feeling compressed, how to build something that would last, that would respect the people inside it. She was good at it, better than she'd been at anything before, because she finally understood that the best structures weren't built from the top down. She paid her own rent, drove a car that made a sound on cold starts she kept meaning to have diagnosed, made school lunches at 6:15 in the morning, packed in boxes the girls had decorated with markers Clara's covered in suns, Mara's in careful geometric patterns that suggested she'd inherited her father's quality of exact attention. The girls grew. Mara developed her father's stillness, that quality of absolute attention that looked like judgment, until you understood it was just the way she processed the world, completely, without shortcuts. She started drawing buildings, the architectural logic intuitive in her from the beginning. She drew their house over and over from different angles, adding rooms it didn't have, imagining what it could become. She drew the glass house on the cliff. She drew a house Stacy almost didn't recognize until she studied the proportions, the angle of the roofline, the relationship of the door to the windows. The bunker. Mara was drawing the bunker as a home it had never been, as if reconstructing it from memory was a way of making peace with it. Clara grew loud and bright and relentlessly curious, the kind of child who asked questions that made adults pause and feel the ground shift. She started singing, not the frightened humming she'd done in dark rooms, but actual singing, full-throated and unself-conscious, in the car and the shower and the quiet moments between other things. She sang the lullaby sometimes. When she did, Stacy had to breathe carefully for a few seconds because the melody still carried everything it had ever carried. They visited Minjae every week without exception. Stacy drove 2 hours each way, the route memorized to the point where her hands made the turns without consulting her. She watched her daughters press their palms flat against the barrier the way he'd once pressed his hand to the window of the cliff house. And she thought about the things we build between ourselves and the world, and whether they protect us or just delay the contact we're afraid of. He looked older through the glass. Not time older, changed older. The architecture of his face had settled into itself, less managed, more inhabited. He read philosophy, history, child development, architecture. He asked her once, his voice careful through the phone that connected their sides of the glass, whether she was okay. Not the girls, not the legal proceedings. Her, whether she was okay. She thought about it for a moment. Actually thought instead of answering reflexively. "I'm building something," she said. He looked at her through the glass with those eyes that had been watching her for 6 years in one way or another. "Tell me what it looks like." So she told him. The yellow door, the window boxes she'd planted, the way the girls were growing, the firm. The car with the sound she kept meaning to fix. The Saturday mornings when the three of them made pancakes in a kitchen that was too small by any standard, and exactly the right size for what they were. He listened to all of it, asked questions, paid attention with the entirety of himself, which was what he'd always done, what had always made being seen by him feel like being understood, and she'd stopped being afraid of it. She didn't wait for him the way a woman in a story waits suspended. Her life paused, counting down to a return that would complete her. She was not incomplete. She was building something real, and the fact that she wanted him to come back was not a structural weakness. It was just true. She told him that through the glass, on a visit in the 2nd year, while the girls did their homework at the table to her right. He was quiet for a long moment after she said it. "Say that again," he said. "I want you to come back," she said. "Not because I need you to, because I want you to. Because when I think about the house and the yellow door, and whatever we're building, the thing I imagine is you walking through it. That's just true. I'm not afraid of it anymore." He put his hand against the glass. She put hers against it from her side, 2 millimeters of barrier between his warmth and hers. She held it there until the guard indicated time was up. Then she drove 2 hours home with the girls sleeping in the back seat, and sat in the driveway for a few minutes in the dark, not going in yet, just sitting with the specific quality of that moment. The 3rd year was quieter. The legal proceedings moved forward with the momentum of federal cases, built on 4 years of meticulous evidence. Lee Sun-young's trial occupied the news cycle and then receded, and then returned for sentencing, and Stacy watched the coverage on her laptop in the kitchen while the girls were in bed, and felt not triumph but a flat, clean relief like a window being opened in a room that had needed air for a long time. She testified. She was clear and factual and thorough, and she performed nothing. Afterwards, she drove home and made herself tea and sat with it until it was cold. In March of the 3rd year, a letter arrived with the prison's return address. 2 sentences. The first, "I get out in 6 months." The second, in his handwriting, which she would know anywhere, "The door isn't locked." The prison gates opened at 7:14 on a gray Tuesday morning in March. She'd arrived at 7. She was always early to things she cared about. The girls were beside her, bundled into their coats, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, their attention on the gates, with the concentrated patience of children who've learned that important things require waiting for. The morning was the color of unfinished concrete. It smelled like rain thinking about it, like the cold that comes off institutional buildings, like the coffee in the thermos she'd brought and hadn't opened yet. The girls had made no particular considerations about their appearance. Mara wore her purple coat and the rain boots with frogs on them that she'd had for a year and was nearly too big for. Clara had insisted on a hat with bear ears despite the temperature not requiring it, and Stacy had decided this was not the battle of the morning. At 7:14 the gates opened. He walked through them and stopped. He was wearing clothes she didn't recognize, cheap jeans, in a slightly wrong wash, a dark jacket that fit well enough, clothing assembled from limited options rather than chosen from abundance. He was carrying a plastic bag in both hands, containing whatever a person was given back when they walked out of a place they'd been for 3 years. He stopped just outside the gate and looked up at the sky. Not dramatically, not performing it, just stood there with his face tilted slightly upward, taking in the gray morning, breathing what outside air felt like after 3 years of institutional air, wearing the sky on his face like something he'd been rationing. She didn't move. She let him have the moment. It belonged to him. Then he lowered his head and looked at her. He was older. The surface fact of it, the physical record of 3 years. But the face had settled into itself in a new way, less managed, more inhabited. The architecture of it shifted by years of interior work that had nothing to perform for. He looked like a man who had stopped performing who he was and had simply become it. The twins broke away from her. They had been so patient, 6-year-olds with the extraordinary patience of children who understand that something important is about to happen and have chosen, in their small and certain wisdom, to hold still for it. But when his eyes found them, when he looked at his daughters for the first time in 3 years, they broke, both at once, as if a signal had been given on a frequency only the three of them shared. They ran. The sound of their feet on the pavement was the sound of everything coming loose at once. Mara ran with her father's efficiency, purposeful and direct. Clara ran with her arms already out, already claiming the space between them as belonging to her. Minjae dropped to his knees on the pavement before they reached him, set the bag aside, opened his arms, and they crashed into him like the ocean coming back to shore, inevitable, complete, belonging to each other in a way that had never depended on proximity, and never would. Mara's voice came first, fierce and full of relief. "Daddy, Daddy, you came back." "I came back," he said, his voice breaking on the second word. "I told you I would." Clara was crying and laughing in the same breath, both sounds tangled into something that was neither, just 3 years of missing released all at once. Minjae held them both against his chest with his eyes closed and his face pressed into the curls he'd last touched on a rain-slicked tarmac while handcuffs were being put on his wrists. Stacy walked toward them slowly. She was in no hurry. She had been in a hurry for so long running calculations, staying ahead of threats, maintaining exits, and she was done with hurry. She walked toward the man on his knees and the daughters wrapping themselves around him, and she felt the peculiar lightness of a person setting down something heavy they'd been carrying so long they'd stopped noticing the weight. She stopped in front of him. He looked up at her from his knees, her daughters pressed against him, his eyes full of everything 3 years of glass hadn't been able to diminish. He stood. The girls stayed attached, one on each side, their arms around his waist, watching both parents at once, with the particular vigilance of children who have learned the ground can shift. It wouldn't shift. Not today. His hand came up and touched her face. Light and certain. The way you touch something you've been careful with for so long that the care has become its own kind of knowing. She put her hand over his. There is a line by James Baldwin that had been on her bathroom mirror for 3 years, on a yellow sticky note she looked at every morning. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. She and Minjae had spent years running from the truths they were most afraid of. He from the knowledge that love without freedom is just a beautiful cage. She from the knowledge that safety without trust is just a prettier kind of loneliness. It wasn't until they stopped running, until they stood in the rain with nothing left to hide behind, that anything could actually change. They didn't get the empire. They didn't get the clean ending. They got each other, with the full weight of everything they'd been. Standing outside a prison gate on a gray Tuesday morning with 2 daughters who had bear ear hats and frog boots, and a father who kept his promises. "We didn't build a fortress," she said. "No," he agreed. "We built a home." He looked at her, this woman who had run from him and fought him and humbled herself and saved him and waited 3 years, with a yellow door and a life she'd built with her own hands, and felt something in his chest finally, completely, come to rest. "And this time," he said quietly, "the door isn't locked." Mara, still pressed against his chest, tilted her head back to look at both of them with those dark, exact eyes. She'd heard. She always heard everything. She reached up and pressed her small palm to his chest, then reached her other hand to her mother's arm, connecting them, completing the circuit. "Same," she said softly, and it was. Some people spend their whole lives building walls and calling it wisdom. Some people spend their whole lives tearing walls down and calling it love. The truth, the hard, unglamorous truth, is that neither is enough on its own. What saves you is learning the difference between a wall that protects and a wall that imprisons, and having the courage to tell the difference even when they look exactly the same from the inside. Stacy and Minjae didn't get the fairy tale. They got something better, the real thing, built slowly, broken apart, rebuilt again from the foundation up, this time with the doors facing outward. This is Velvet Noir. We tell the stories that leave marks. Before you go, tell us this. Have you ever had to burn down your own escape plan to fully commit to something? Have you ever chosen someone not because it was safe, but because it was true? Tell us in the comments. Because that's what this story was really asking all along. Subscribe to Velvet Noir. Stay in the shadow with us. The next story is already waiting.